The bedroom smelled of formaldehyde and roses when authorities finally broke down the door in May of 1936. What they found wrapped in linen beside Vera Hutchins had been dead for 7 years. She was wearing her wedding dress, and the pillow next to the corpse still held the impression of her head. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The autumn of 1928 arrived cold and early in the remote hollows of Clay County, Kentucky. Vera Hutchins stood at the window of her cabin, watching the first frost settle on the mountain laurel, when she heard Owen's breathing change. They had been married for 3 years, living in the cabin his grandfather built, carved into the hillside where the morning fog hung thick enough to cut. Owen was 26, strong from timber work, but pneumonia had taken hold with a speed that terrified them both. The circuit-riding doctor arrived 2 days later, his horse struggling up the narrow path. He examined Owen by lamplight, listening to lungs that rattled like stones in a bucket, and offered what comfort he could. There were no hospitals within 50 miles, no medicines that would reach them in time. Owen died on October 14th, his hand in Vera's, his last words asking her not to leave him alone in the dark. The doctor returned the next morning to sign the death certificate. He expected to find Vera grieving, perhaps surrounded by neighbors preparing the body for burial. Instead, he found the cabin door barred and Vera's voice firm through the wooden planks. She didn't need an undertaker. She didn't need help. Owen was resting, and she would care for him herself. The doctor, accustomed to mountain ways and the fierce independence of hollow people, left his condolences and departed. He noted in his journal that grief affected people differently, and he expected Vera's family would handle the burial when she was ready. What the doctor couldn't have known was that Vera had already begun her work. Her father had been a taxidermist, preserving hunting trophies and beloved pets for wealthy families in Lexington before his own death 5 years prior. She had watched him work since childhood, learning the properties of formaldehyde, the importance of temperature control, the way salt could draw moisture from tissue. She had access to his old supplies, stored in the cabin's cellar, waiting. That first night, with Owen's body still warm, Vera opened the bedroom window wide. The October cold rushed in, sharp and preserving. She worked by candlelight, her hands steady with purpose. She told herself it was temporary, that she needed time to say goodbye properly, that the ground would be too hard for burial soon, and spring would be better. She whispered to Owen as she worked, explaining what she was doing, promising him she would never let him go cold and alone into the earth. The formaldehyde burned her throat as she applied it with careful precision. She positioned his body with reverence, arranging his hands across his chest the way he used to sleep. She changed him into clean clothes, the Sunday shirt he wore to church, and covered him with their wedding quilt. When she finally lay down beside him, exhausted and hollowed out by grief, she told herself this was just for tonight, just until she was strong enough to let him go. The lie felt warm and necessary in the dark. The mountain wind howled through the open window, and Vera pressed closer to what remained of her husband, seeking comfort in the familiar shape of him. She would bury him in spring, she promised herself, when the ground thawed and the world felt less cruel. She slept with her hand on his chest, waiting for a heartbeat that would never come, and in the morning, she woke with a new conviction settling in her bones. Owen needed her, and she would not abandon him to the grave. Spring came and went without a burial, By the summer of 1929, Vera's neighbors had begun to notice that something in the Hutchins cabin had shifted beyond ordinary grief. The first sign was the general store visits. Vera arrived every Saturday morning, her appearance increasingly disheveled, her movements quick and furtive. She purchased food in careful pairs: 2 apples, 2 portions of salt pork, 2 tins of beans. When the clerk, an older woman named Dolly Krebs, mentioned that she was buying enough for 2 people, Vera smiled with unsettling brightness and said Owen had a powerful appetite lately. Dolly watched Vera leave, troubled by the exchange. Owen Hutchins had been buried months ago, hadn't he? But then again, no one had actually attended a funeral. No one had seen a grave. The mountain communities respected privacy above almost all else, but Dolly made a note in the ledger beside Vera's purchases. Something to remember if questions were ever asked. The second sign came from Vera's younger sister, Loretta, who lived 8 miles away in a slightly larger settlement. Loretta attempted to visit in June, bringing fresh bread and concern. She found Vera on the porch, blocking the door with her body, speaking in a low, urgent voice that suggested argument. When Loretta asked who she was talking to, Vera said Owen was resting and couldn't be disturbed. He'd had a difficult night, she explained. The fever was breaking, but he needed quiet. Loretta tried to push past her sister, concern sharpening into alarm, but Vera's grip on the doorframe was iron. Her eyes held something Loretta had never seen before, something wild and defensive. "He's getting better," Vera insisted. "The doctor said it would take time, but he's improving every day. You can visit when he's stronger." There had been no doctor. Loretta knew this with cold certainty. She also knew that arguing with Vera in this state would accomplish nothing. She left the bread on the porch rail and walked back down the mountain path, her mind working through possibilities she didn't want to consider. By August, the local Baptist preacher, Reverend Silas Drummond, decided intervention was necessary. He'd heard the rumors, dismissed most of them as gossip. But Loretta's visit to his church had troubled him deeply. He made the journey to the Hutchins cabin on a Tuesday afternoon, prepared to offer spiritual counsel and practical assistance. Vera met him at the property line, before he could even reach the porch. She was cordial, but immovable. Yes, she was managing fine. No, she didn't need help with the burial because Owen was recovering. The pneumonia had been severe, but her nursing had pulled him through. He was weak, certainly, but improving daily. She spoke with such conviction, such detailed certainty about symptoms and progress, that Reverend Drummond found himself momentarily uncertain. "Vera," he said gently, "I was told Owen passed last October. I offered to conduct the service." Her face hardened. "People talk without understanding. Owen was very ill, near death perhaps, but I wouldn't let him go. I stayed with him every night, kept him warm, tended to him. He's still weak, but he's here. He's with me." The Reverend requested to see Owen, to pray with him, if nothing else. Vera's refusal was absolute. Owen couldn't tolerate visitors in his weakened state. Perhaps in a few months, when he'd regained his strength. She thanked the Reverend for his concern and walked back toward the cabin, ending the conversation through sheer force of will. Reverend Drummond returned to town deeply unsettled. He spoke with the county sheriff, a man named Howard Gentry, suggesting a welfare check might be warranted. But Sheriff Gentry was dealing with a string of bootlegging operations and had little patience for what seemed like a grief-stricken widow's eccentricity. Unless someone reported an actual crime, he explained, mountain people had the right to their privacy and their peculiar ways of mourning. Throughout the autumn of 1929, Vera's isolation became nearly complete. She stopped attending church services. She limited her store visits to the bare minimum, always purchasing in pairs, always maintaining the fiction of Owen's presence. Neighbors who passed the cabin reported hearing her voice through the walls, sometimes singing, sometimes speaking in conversational tones, sometimes reading aloud from the Bible. The most disturbing report came from a traveling tinker who stopped at the cabin in November, hoping to sell wares or offer repairs. He knocked at the door and heard Vera's voice call out that she'd be right there. But before she opened the door, he heard her speaking to someone inside. "I'll only be a moment, my love. Stay warm under the blankets. I'll bring you something hot when he leaves." The tinker saw no one else when Vera cracked the door open. He saw only a woman whose eyes held too much determination and too little sleep, whose smile was bright and terrible, and whose hands, when she waved him away, were stained with something dark that might have been chemicals, or might have been something worse. He left quickly and never returned to that hollow. By December, Vera had stopped explaining Owen's absence to anyone. She simply existed in her cabin, with the windows sealed against winter, and her certainty sealed against reason. Inside, the bedroom remained cold, the body remained preserved, and Vera's devotion remained absolute. She had committed herself to a path from which there could be no returning, and the long winter ahead would only deepen her descent into a reality constructed entirely from love and delusion. The rituals began in earnest during the winter of 1930. What had started as preservation became something far more disturbing, a routine that Vera followed with religious precision. Every evening at dusk, she would enter the bedroom with fresh water, clean cloths, and her father's old grooming kit. The process took hours, and she performed it with the tender attention of a bride preparing for her wedding night. First came the unwrapping. Owen's body, now over a year deceased, had been carefully bound in layers of linen soaked in preservatives. Vera would slowly remove each layer, examining the skin beneath with clinical focus. The formaldehyde and mountain cold had done their work well. The body had mummified rather than rotted, the flesh drawing tight against bone, taking on the appearance of old leather. Where hair had fallen away, Vera had saved it in envelopes, pressing it like flowers. She spoke to him constantly during these sessions, about the weather, about supplies she needed from town, about memories from their courtship. "Do you remember the church social where you first asked me to dance?" she would murmur, working preservative into the dried tissue of his hands. "You were so nervous you stepped on my foot 3 times. I didn't mind. I knew then you were the one." The clothing changes happened weekly. Vera had kept all of Owen's shirts, his 2 good pairs of trousers, his Sunday jacket. She would dress him with care, her hands working around the stiffened limbs with practiced efficiency. When his joints no longer bent properly, she slit the seams of his clothes to make them fit, then sewed them closed again, while he wore them. The appearance of normalcy was what mattered, the illusion of a husband who might, at any moment, sit up and speak. The makeup application was perhaps the most unsettling detail that investigators would later document. Vera had purchased rouge, powder, and lip stain from a catalog, explaining to the postmaster that she wanted to look nice for her husband. What she didn't mention was that the cosmetics were for Owen. Each night she would apply color to his sunken cheeks, trying to create the flush of life where only death remained. She painted his lips a pale pink. She used pencil to darken where his eyebrows had thinned. The effect was grotesque, but in the dim lamplight of the cabin, Vera saw only her husband's face. The sleeping arrangement completed the ritual. Vera would position Owen in the center of the bed, propped with pillows, to create the illusion of someone merely resting. She had sewn his mouth shut months earlier, when the jaw began to separate, telling herself it was to help him rest more peacefully. Then she would change into her nightgown, extinguish the lamp, and slide into bed beside him. She pressed herself against the rigid form, her arm draped across what remained of his chest, her head on the pillow next to his. The smell no longer bothered her. She had become accustomed to the sweet, sick odor of preservatives mixed with decay, had convinced herself it was simply the scent of the medicines keeping Owen alive. In the darkness, she would whisper to him about her day, about her hopes for their future, about the children she still believed they would have once he fully recovered. "I know you can hear me," she would murmur into the silence. "I know you're trying to come back to me. Just hold on a little longer, my love. Don't leave me here alone." The most disturbing evidence of her delusion came from the diary she kept during this period, later recovered by authorities. The entries were written as though Owen were a willing participant in their life together. "Owen and I had breakfast together this morning. Owen seemed stronger today, his color much improved. Owen held me close last night, and I felt so safe in his arms." But scattered among these entries were glimpses of awareness that she quickly suppressed. "Sometimes I think I see things that aren't there, but Owen assures me I'm doing everything right. The preservation is holding well, thank God. I couldn't bear it if he started to slip away from me." These moments of clarity never lasted. Vera would catch herself, then double down on the fantasy, writing even more detailed accounts of conversations that never happened and improvements that would never come. By spring, she had begun to believe that Owen communicated with her through dreams. She would wake and immediately write down his messages, instructions about maintaining the cabin, reassurances of his love, promises that he would soon be well enough to walk with her again. The dreams became more elaborate, more specific, providing her with justification for every increasingly bizarre decision. She sealed the bedroom windows with tar paper that March, claiming Owen had asked for darkness to help him heal. The temperature control became obsessive. She monitored it constantly, adjusting blankets, opening or closing the window by fractions, treating the room like an incubator for something that might yet live. And the mattress beneath them had become permanently stained, dark patches spreading despite her efforts to keep everything clean. She covered these with extra sheets, with quilts, with anything that would hide the evidence of what was truly happening in that bed. When the stains seeped through anyway, she simply added more layers, building a nest of fabric and denial that grew thicker with each passing month. The isolation suited her purposes. Fewer visitors meant fewer questions. Fewer questions meant she could maintain the reality she had constructed, the world where Owen was simply ill and she was simply devoted. In that cold bedroom, with its chemical smell and its terrible secret, Vera Hutchins had created a marriage that death itself could not dissolve. By the summer of 1931, the whispers in Clay County had grown too numerous to ignore. The mail carrier, a man named Curtis Brennan, was the first to document his concerns in an official capacity. His route included the Hutchins cabin, and what he witnessed during his monthly deliveries troubled him enough to mention it to the postmaster. Curtis reported hearing singing at strange hours, lullabies mostly, the kind a mother might sing to a sick child. But the voice carried an edge of desperation that made his skin crawl. Once, arriving earlier than usual, he heard Vera speaking through the cabin door in two distinct tones. One, her normal voice asking a question, then a pause, then a deeper voice that she was clearly producing herself, answering. She was having both sides of a conversation with Owen, speaking for him when he could not speak for himself. The postmaster, Edgar Vance, listened to Curtis's report with growing unease. He had his own observations to add. Vera's correspondence had become increasingly strange. She had begun sending letters addressed to Owen's mother in Virginia, letters that Edgar had been required to mark as undeliverable since the woman had died 3 years prior. He had opened one, concerned it might contain something requiring intervention. The letter described a thriving household, Owen's recovery, their plans to visit in the fall. It was dated April of 1931, nearly 3 years after Owen's death. But documentation of concern and actual intervention were separated by a wide gulf in rural Kentucky. Edgar filed his observations in a drawer with other oddities and troubling situations that never quite warranted official action. The Depression had arrived with devastating force, and resources for welfare checks on eccentric widows simply didn't exist. The general store became another source of disturbing intelligence. Dolly Krebs had been tracking Vera's purchases with increasing alarm. The woman bought food in pairs, yes, but she also purchased items that made no sense for someone caring for an invalid. Embalming supplies, industrial quantities of formaldehyde, salt in amounts that would preserve meat for a year. When Dolly gently suggested that perhaps Vera might want to speak with a doctor about Owen's condition, Vera's response was brittle and defensive. "Owen's care is my responsibility," she said, her voice sharp. "He doesn't need doctors poking at him, upsetting his recovery. I know what he needs. I'm the only one who knows." Dolly watched her leave and immediately spoke to her husband, who served on the county board. Something needed to be done, she insisted. A woman alone in a cabin with what was surely a corpse, playing house with death itself. But her husband, like so many others, fell back on mountain tradition. People had a right to their privacy. Unless someone reported an actual crime, unless there was evidence of danger to others, the law couldn't simply break down a door based on gossip and suspicion. The new sheriff, Howard Gentry, having retired, was a younger man named Luke Peterson. In the fall of 1932, Loretta made another attempt to force intervention. She visited Sheriff Peterson's office with 3 years of observations, letters, and witness statements. She begged him to conduct a welfare check to verify that Owen was either alive or properly buried. Sheriff Peterson listened, took notes, and explained the legal reality. Without evidence of a crime in progress, without proof that someone was in immediate danger, he couldn't force entry to a private residence. Vera was an adult, capable of managing her own affairs. If she wanted to live alone in a cabin and pretend her dead husband was alive, that was her affair. The state had no authority to intervene in delusions that harmed no one but the deluded. "But she's living with a corpse," Loretta said, her voice breaking. "She's sleeping next to my brother-in-law's body. That can't be legal." Sheriff Peterson consulted the county attorney, a man more familiar with bootlegging cases and property disputes than the psychological deterioration of isolated widows. The attorney's opinion was clear. Unless they had evidence that Vera had murdered Owen, unless they had proof that she was desecrating a grave or committing some other specific crime, they had no grounds for a warrant. The fact that she might be keeping a body in her home was disturbing, but not, in itself, illegal, if that body was her husband's, and if no one could prove he hadn't died of natural causes. The justice of the peace, when consulted, refused to sign any warrant without substantially more evidence. The Depression had made everyone cautious about overreach, about wasting resources on situations that might resolve themselves. And truthfully, many in the community were uncomfortable with the idea of forcing themselves into Vera's grief, however twisted it had become. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Vera continued her routines, unaware of the discussions happening in town offices and around dinner tables. She had stopped caring what anyone thought. The only opinion that mattered was Owen's, and Owen, she told herself with absolute conviction, approved of everything she did. He needed her. He depended on her. And she would not fail him, no matter how many people questioned her devotion. The smell from the cabin had grown stronger with the summer heat, a sweet rotting odor that hung in the hollow like fog. Neighbors began avoiding the path that led past the Hutchins property. Children who once played in the creek nearby were kept away by parents who spoke in hushed tones about poor Vera and her troubles. The community response was a combination of pity, disgust, and a fierce determination to mind their own business, a cultural trait that would allow the situation to continue far longer than anyone later thought possible. By the end of 1932, Vera Hutchins had successfully isolated herself and her terrible secret from any meaningful intervention. The institutions that might have helped her had been paralyzed by legal constraints, limited resources, and cultural reluctance to violate privacy. Owen's body continued its slow transformation in the sealed bedroom, and Vera's grip on reality continued its steady dissolution. The stage was set for 3 more years of horror that no one had the power or will to stop. The cabin itself began to die along with Vera's sanity. By 1933, the structure showed signs of profound neglect that mirrored the horror contained within its walls. Paint peeled in long strips from the exterior boards, exposing gray wood underneath that warped in the mountain humidity. The front porch sagged dangerously on one side, its boards soft with rot. Weeds had overtaken what had once been Vera's vegetable garden, growing tall enough to brush against the windows. But it was the smell that made the cabin's condition impossible to ignore. A thick, sweet odor of decay mixed with chemical preservatives seeped from every crack and crevice. Neighbors who had once considered checking on Vera now crossed to the opposite side of the path when passing nearby. The stench was worst in summer, when heat intensified everything, but even in winter it lingered, a testament to what was decomposing inside despite Vera's increasingly frantic efforts. Those efforts had become desperate by necessity. Owen's body, now nearly 5 years deceased, was fighting her attempts at preservation. The mummification had held initially, but time and biology were relentless enemies. Vera found herself working longer hours each night, applying more formaldehyde, wrapping and rewrapping the body in cloth that she soaked in preservatives purchased from 3 different counties to avoid suspicion. Her financial records from this period, later examined by investigators, revealed the extent of her obsession. She had spent nearly all of Owen's veteran pension on preservation supplies, orders to pharmacies in Lexington, Louisville, and even Cincinnati, shipments of embalming fluid, sodium carbonate, glycerin, and various alcohols used in taxidermy. The postal workers who delivered these packages noted them in their logs, adding to the growing file of concerns that no one had authority to act upon. The wrapping technique evolved out of necessity. Where Owen's skin had once held together under basic treatment, it now required layers upon layers of cloth to contain. Vera created what amounted to a cocoon, wrapping the body from feet to head in strips of linen soaked in her preservative mixture. The process took hours each week, and she performed it with the focused intensity of someone conducting a sacred ritual. She spoke to him throughout, her monologue never stopping. "I know it's uncomfortable, my love, but it's keeping you safe. Once you're stronger, we won't need to do this anymore. You'll be able to move around again. Talk to me properly. Just a little longer." The bedroom had become a laboratory of death. Glass bottles lined the dresser, each labeled in Vera's careful handwriting with contents and mixing ratios. Stacks of clean linen waited to be used. A basin held her tools, scissors and brushes and measuring spoons, all stained dark from repeated use. The bed itself had transformed into something nightmarish. The mattress so saturated with fluids and chemicals that it had begun to deteriorate, stuffing, pushing through holes in the fabric. In July of 1933, a traveling salesman named Raymond Pike stopped at the cabin seeking directions. He knocked twice before Vera appeared at a window rather than the door. Her face, visible through the dusty glass, looked gaunt and pale, her hair unwashed and tangled. When he asked for directions to the next town, she provided them quickly, her eyes darting back toward the interior of the cabin as though worried about leaving something unattended. What Raymond noticed, what he later reported to authorities, was the view through the window behind Vera. He caught a glimpse of the bedroom door standing open, and what he saw made his blood run cold. A figure wrapped entirely in stained cloth, propped upright in a bed, its shape unmistakably human, but its stillness absolute. Vera noticed his gaze and quickly pulled the curtain closed, but the image stayed with Raymond for the rest of his life. He reported it to the sheriff in the next county, assuming surely this was already known, already being addressed. But the report got filed with dozens of others, the bureaucracy of rural law enforcement moving too slowly to matter. By the time anyone followed up, weeks had passed, and the trail of official concern led nowhere concrete. Vera's isolation had become total by autumn. She no longer ventured to church, no longer made her weekly trips to the general store. Instead, she sent written lists and payment with whoever happened to pass by, willing to deliver them. The lists always requested supplies for 2 people, always included items that suggested an active household. But the money she sent smelled of chemicals, and the people who entered her cabin to deliver supplies reported scenes of shocking decay. One delivery man, dropping off flour and sugar, noticed that every surface in the main room was covered with a fine white powder. Vera explained it was lime, helping to control moisture and odor. What she didn't explain was that the odor had grown so overwhelming that she had resorted to spreading lime throughout the entire cabin, creating a caustic environment that burned her lungs and throat, but seemed preferable to acknowledging what the smell meant. Her hands showed the effects of constant chemical exposure. The skin had become cracked and discolored, permanently stained from the preservatives she handled daily. Her fingernails were yellow and brittle. When she occasionally saw her reflection, she barely recognized herself, but she told herself it didn't matter. Owen was what mattered. Keeping him with her was what mattered. Everything else was secondary to that singular purpose. The photographs she took that summer, later discovered in a shoebox, revealed the extent of her delusion. Using an old Kodak camera, she staged pictures of herself beside the wrapped figure. In some, she smiled at the camera as though posing for a normal portrait. In others, she positioned herself as if in conversation with the cocoon that had once been her husband. The images were deeply unsettling, showing a woman who had created an entire reality around death and convinced herself it was life. By December, even the most stubborn defenders of privacy in the community were beginning to question whether Vera's situation could continue. But questioning and acting remained 2 different things, separated by legal barriers and cultural reluctance that would take nearly 3 more years to overcome. Loretta Hutchins made her final attempt to reach her sister in March of 1934. She had stayed away for nearly a year, unable to face what she knew was happening in that cabin. But guilt and family obligation finally drove her back up the mountain path. What she found broke something inside her that would never fully heal. Vera answered the door after the fifth knock, and Loretta barely recognized her. The woman standing in the doorway had aged a decade in the year since they'd last met. Her hair, once dark and glossy, had gone streaked with gray and hung in matted clumps around her face. Her skin had taken on a yellowish tinge from chemical exposure. But it was her eyes that frightened Loretta most, bright with an intensity that suggested both complete conviction and complete madness. "Loretta," Vera said, her voice carrying false cheerfulness. "How wonderful. But I'm afraid this isn't a good time. Owen's having one of his difficult days." "Vera, please." Loretta kept her voice gentle. "Let me come in. Let me help you." What followed was a negotiation that lasted 20 minutes, Vera blocking the door while making excuses, Loretta pushing harder than she had ever dared. Finally, perhaps from exhaustion or perhaps from a buried desire to share her secret, Vera stepped aside. The interior nearly made Loretta turn and run. The main room was barely recognizable as a living space. Every surface was covered with bottles, jars, and chemical containers. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of decay and preservatives that made Loretta's eyes water. Lime powder coated the floor in drifts like snow. The furniture had been pushed against the walls to make room for what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory, complete with measuring equipment and notebooks filled with Vera's increasingly erratic handwriting. But it was the bedroom that revealed the true horror. The door stood partially open, and Loretta could see the bed with its massive wrapped shape occupying the center. Vera noticed her staring and moved to close the door, but not before speaking about Owen, as though he were merely sleeping in the next room. "He's doing much better lately," Vera said, her hand on the doorknob. "His color has improved. I've been adjusting his treatments, and I think we're finally achieving the right balance. The doctor said it would take years, but I'm seeing real progress." There were no doctors. There had never been doctors. Loretta felt tears burning in her eyes as she watched her sister. This woman who had once been smart and capable and grounded in reality describe a recovery that existed only in her fractured mind. "The wrappings need to be changed daily now," Vera continued, speaking rapidly as if she'd been waiting years to explain her work to someone. "The preservation is more delicate than it was. I have to be so careful with the mixtures. Too much formaldehyde causes discoloration. Too little, and the tissue begins to break down. But I've gotten quite skilled at it. Father would be proud of how I've applied his techniques." Loretta tried to speak, to break through the delusion, but Vera was too far gone. She showed Loretta her notebooks, pages filled with detailed records of treatments, observations about Owen's supposed condition, notes about his preferences and needs. It read like the diary of a devoted caregiver, except the patient had been dead for over 5 years. "He communicates with me at night," Vera said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Not in words exactly, but I understand what he needs. Last week he told me through a dream that he wanted me to change his shirt more often. He's becoming more aware, you see. More responsive. It's a sign that the healing is taking hold." The moment that would haunt Loretta for the rest of her life came when Vera insisted on showing her the bedroom. Before Loretta could refuse, Vera had opened the door wide and stepped inside, gesturing proudly at the wrapped figure on the bed. "Doesn't he look peaceful?" Vera asked, moving to the bedside and placing her hand on the cocoon of stained cloth. "I was just about to comb his hair. Would you like to help?" The shape under the wrappings was unmistakably human, but impossibly still. The odor in the room, despite all of Vera's chemicals and lime, was the undeniable smell of death. Loretta watched in horror as Vera produced a comb and began stroking it over the wrapped head, humming softly, completely absorbed in her grotesque parody of wifely care. "We still have our intimacy," Vera said suddenly, not looking up from her combing. "People think that ends when someone is ill, but it doesn't. Owen still wants me. I can feel it when I lie beside him. The connection between us, it transcends his physical limitations. We're closer now than we ever were before." Loretta fled. She made it as far as the front porch before vomiting, her body's response to the smell and the horror of what she'd witnessed. Behind her, she could hear Vera calling after her, confused and hurt, asking why she was leaving so soon when Owen had been so looking forward to her visit. The walk down the mountain passed in a blur of tears and shock. By the time Loretta reached her own home, she had made a decision. She would document everything she had seen, every detail, every disturbing statement, every piece of evidence that her sister was living with a corpse and had descended into complete madness. She would take it to Sheriff Peterson again, and this time she would not leave until something was done. She spent 3 days writing her account, pages and pages of observations spanning years. She included dates, names of witnesses, documented purchases from the general store. She described the smell, the wrapped figure, Vera's claims about Owen's recovery, and their continued physical relationship. She wrote until her hand cramped, determined to create a record so complete that no official could dismiss it as mere gossip. But when she presented it to Sheriff Peterson in early April, his response was the same as before. Disturbing, yes. Grounds for a warrant, no. The legal system required more than witness testimony. They needed evidence of a crime, not just evidence of profound psychological disturbance. Loretta left his office feeling defeated and desperate, knowing that her sister was trapped in a nightmare, but unable to force anyone to intervene. Back in the cabin, unaware of Loretta's efforts, Vera returned to her routines. She had been upset by her sister's reaction, confused by her abrupt departure, but ultimately, she dismissed it. People outside the cabin didn't understand. They couldn't understand the depth of love required to do what she was doing. Only she and Owen knew the truth of their devotion, and that was enough. The autumn of 1935 marked 7 years since Owen's death, though in Vera's mind it marked 7 years of devoted caregiving and unwavering marital commitment. She had planned something special for their anniversary, a celebration that would prove to herself and to Owen that their love had survived everything the world had thrown at them. She spent weeks preparing. Using what remained of her savings, she ordered fabric from a catalog and sewed a new dress, white like a wedding gown, with lace at the collar, that she stitched by hand in the dim lamplight. She baked a cake using carefully hoarded sugar and flour, decorating it with dried flowers from the mountain. She even found candles, precious commodities during the Depression, and arranged them around the bedroom in a circle that reminded her of their wedding ceremony at the Baptist church. On October 14th, the actual date Owen had died 7 years prior, Vera celebrated what she called their renewal day. She dressed in her white gown, taking care with her appearance for the first time in months. She washed her hair, applied rouge to her own cheeks, and even found lipstick that had belonged to her mother. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a bride ready to recommit herself to her husband. The ceremony she conducted was elaborate and deeply disturbing. She positioned Owen's wrapped body upright against the headboard, propping him with every pillow in the cabin. She arranged his wrappings to suggest a suit, even pinning a fabric flower to what would have been his lapel. Then she set up her old Kodak camera on a stack of books, adjusting the angle until it captured both of them in frame. The photographs from that day, later recovered by investigators, showed a woman in a homemade wedding dress standing beside a human-shaped cocoon of stained cloth. In some images, Vera smiled at the camera with an expression of genuine joy. In others, she positioned herself as though dancing with the wrapped figure, her arms around it in a grotesque parody of a wedding waltz. The final photograph showed her sitting on the bed beside Owen, her head resting against the wrappings, her eyes closed in what appeared to be contentment. She spoke vows aloud in the empty cabin, promising again to love and honor, to care for in sickness and in health. She cut the cake with ceremony, placing a piece on a plate that she set beside Owen's form, as though he might consume it. Then she ate her own piece slowly, savoring the sweetness, narrating the celebration to her silent companion. "This is our finest moment," she told him, her voice carrying through the chemical thick air. 7 years of devotion, 7 years of proving that love doesn't end. You've been so patient with your recovery, my darling, so strong through all of this. I'm so proud of you. The letters she wrote during this period revealed the complete collapse of her connection to reality. Addressed to Owen's mother, who had been dead for years, these letters described a thriving household and a recovering husband. They were detailed and specific, creating an elaborate fiction that Vera herself believed. "Owen has been feeling much stronger lately," one letter read. "He sits up for longer periods now, and his appetite has returned. The doctor says by next spring he should be able to manage short walks. We're planning to visit you then, perhaps in May, when the weather is finest. Owen speaks of you often and is eager to see you." Another letter, dated November, continued the fantasy. "We celebrated our anniversary with a lovely ceremony. Owen was so handsome in his suit, and he told me I looked beautiful. We danced in the bedroom, just like we did at our wedding. I know you would have been proud to see how devoted we remain to each other. Our love has only grown stronger through this trial." She wrote dozens of these letters, stacking them in a box beside the bed, never sending them, but referring to them as though they were part of an ongoing correspondence. Sometimes she would read them aloud to Owen, asking his opinion about what she'd written, then muzzing as though listening to his response before making imaginary corrections. Her journal entries from this period showed a woman who had completely internalized her delusion. She wrote about conversations with Owen as though they were real exchanges. She recorded his supposed opinions about news she'd heard, about weather patterns, about plans for the future. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic, the entries longer and more detailed, as though the more she wrote, the more real it all became. "Owen and I discussed having children today," one entry read. "He's worried he's not strong enough yet to be a father, but I assured him we have time. Once he's fully recovered, we'll start our family. He'll be such a wonderful father, patient and kind, just like he is with me." The most disturbing entries described their physical relationship. Vera wrote about lying beside Owen at night, about the comfort she took from his presence, about moments of intimacy that existed only in her fractured mind. She described sensations and responses that were impossible, creating an entire narrative of marital closeness with a body that had been dead for 7 years. "Last night Owen held me so tenderly," she wrote in December. "I could feel his love in every touch. People who haven't experienced what we have could never understand this depth of connection. Physical limitations mean nothing when two souls are this bound together." She began writing letters to Owen himself, love letters that she would read aloud to the wrapped figure before tucking them under his pillow. They were filled with devotion and promises, declarations of eternal love and gratitude for his patience during his long illness. "My dearest Owen," one began, "7 years ago I promised to stand by you forever, and I have kept that promise. No matter what others say, no matter how long your recovery takes, I will never leave you. We are bound together in ways that transcend this temporary separation caused by your illness. Soon you will be well, and we can begin the life we always dreamed of." The cabin around her continued to deteriorate, but Vera no longer noticed. The outside world had become irrelevant. Only the bedroom mattered, only her rituals, and her certainty that Owen needed her. She had constructed a reality so complete, so detailed, that nothing could penetrate it. Every day she found new evidence of his improvement, new signs that her devotion was being rewarded, new reasons to continue. Winter came hard that year, but Vera barely felt the cold. She had her purpose, her love, and her absolute conviction that what she was doing was right. In the mountain hollow, isolated from intervention and wrapped in delusion, she celebrated her 7th year of widowhood by denying that widowhood had ever occurred. Owen was alive in every way that mattered to her, and no amount of evidence to the contrary could convince her otherwise. The breaking point came on a frigid February morning in 1936. Vera had been burning wood almost constantly to combat the brutal winter, feeding the stove with a desperation that matched her need to maintain the bedroom's temperature. She had become careless, too focused on her routines with Owen to notice the creosote building up in the chimney, the dangerous accumulation of months of neglect. The fire started just after dawn. Flames erupted from the chimney top, visible from the main road a quarter-mile away. Thick black smoke poured into the winter sky, and within minutes, someone had raised the alarm. The volunteer fire brigade, consisting of 12 men from surrounding farms, arrived with buckets and a hand-pumped water cart. Vera met them in the yard, wild-eyed and panicked, but not about the fire. Her concern was singular and terrible. They couldn't come inside. They couldn't disturb Owen. The fire chief, a practical man named Walter Kemp, tried to reason with her while flames licked at the roof. "Ma'am, your house is burning. We need to get inside. Make sure you've got no one trapped. Get your valuables out." "No one comes in," Vera said, her voice shrill. "Owen is resting. The noise and commotion would upset his recovery. I'll handle the fire myself." But she couldn't handle it, and Walter knew if they didn't act quickly, the entire structure would be lost. He made the decision to push past her, ordering 2 of his men to restrain Vera gently, while the rest fought the fire. Her screams followed them into the cabin, desperate pleas not to disturb her husband, not to ruin everything she'd worked for. The smell hit them immediately. Every man stopped, handkerchiefs going to faces, eyes watering from more than just smoke. This wasn't the smell of a chimney fire. This was something organic, something dead, mixed with chemicals that burned their throats. Walter exchanged glances with his deputy chief, and a silent understanding passed between them. They'd found what everyone had whispered about for years. They extinguished the chimney fire quickly. The damage was minimal, contained to the upper portion of the flue. But what they'd encountered inside the cabin couldn't be ignored or forgotten. Walter sent one of the younger volunteers to fetch Sheriff Peterson immediately, then posted 2 men outside to ensure Vera didn't interfere with what was about to become a crime scene investigation. Vera collapsed in the yard, sobbing and begging them to leave. "You don't understand," she kept saying. "He needs me. He'll be frightened without me there. Please, just let me go to him." Sheriff Peterson arrived within the hour, bringing Deputy Eugene Vickers and the county coroner, a physician named Dr. Raymond Finch. Loretta, who had been notified by a neighbor who witnessed the fire brigade's response, came running up the mountain path, arriving breathless and terrified about what they would find. The sheriff took statements from the fire brigade members first. Each man described the overwhelming smell, the chemical bottles everywhere, the sealed bedroom door that Vera had screamed about when they approached it. Walter Kemp added the detail that would finally provide legal grounds for entry. He'd seen what appeared to be a human form in the bed through the open door, wrapped completely in stained cloth, and he believed someone might be in distress or danger. That was enough. Sheriff Peterson had his probable cause at last. Someone might be alive in that room, someone who needed immediate medical attention. The fact that everyone present suspected otherwise didn't matter for legal purposes. He had grounds for a warrant, and Judge Harlan signed it within 2 hours. Loretta provided her years of documentation, the letters and observations, and witness statements she'd compiled. She described her sister's delusions, the anniversary celebration, the claims about Owen's recovery. Dr. Finch listened with growing horror, understanding that what they were about to discover would likely haunt everyone involved. The date was set for entry, May 12, 1936. The delay was necessary to ensure all legal procedures were properly followed, to assemble the right officials, and to prepare for what was clearly going to be a disturbing discovery. The fire had opened a door that could no longer be closed, and the community that had looked away for so long would finally have to confront what their inaction had allowed to continue. Vera was taken to Loretta's home during this waiting period, kept under watch to prevent her from returning to the cabin or harming herself. She spent those months in a state of agitated despair, constantly asking about Owen, insisting he would die without her care, begging anyone who would listen to let her go back to him. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly, could only pace and worry and plan for the moment she could return. "He needs his treatments," she told Loretta over and over. "The wrappings have to be changed. The preservatives need to be reapplied. If I'm not there, he'll deteriorate. All my work, all these years, it will all be for nothing." Loretta tried to prepare her sister for what was coming, tried to gently suggest that Owen was gone, and had been gone for years. But Vera's delusion was armor against reality. She refused every attempt at reason, every gentle suggestion that her husband was dead. In her mind, Owen was in that cabin waiting for her, growing sicker by the day without her devoted care. And these people who claimed to be helping were actually destroying everything she'd built. The spring thaw came early that year, and with it came a smell from the cabin that made even the wards of the sheriff's deputies posted outside reluctant to remain at their station. Whatever was decomposing inside had been preserved by winter cold, but the warming temperatures were accelerating processes that Vera's chemicals could no longer fully control. On the morning of May 11th, the day before the scheduled entry, Sheriff Peterson stood outside the cabin and tried to prepare himself for what they would find. He had seen death before, had investigated murders and accidents and all manner of tragedy, but he suspected that nothing in his experience would prepare him for what Vera Hutchins had created in that sealed bedroom, the monument to grief and madness that had existed for 7 years and 8 months, hidden from the world behind a widow's fierce devotion and a community's reluctance to intervene. Sheriff Boone Talbert knocked on the cabin door at 8:30 on the morning of May 12, 1936. He was accompanied by Deputy Eugene Vickers, Dr. Raymond Finch, and a court stenographer named Margaret Whitfield, who would document everything they found. Each person present had steeled themselves for something terrible, but preparation and reality were about to prove vastly different. Vera had been brought back to the property under supervision, Loretta holding her sister's arm as they stood in the yard. The moment Vera saw the officials approaching her home, she began to plead. Her voice carried the desperation of someone watching their entire world crumble. Please don't wake him. He had such a difficult night. Just give him a few more hours of rest. I'll let you see him this afternoon, I promise. Just don't disturb him now." Sheriff Talbert spoke to her gently but firmly. They had a legal warrant. They had a duty to verify the welfare of anyone inside the residence. Vera's response was to drop to her knees in the dirt, sobbing, begging them to understand that Owen needed his rest, that the intrusion would set back his recovery by months. Loretta held her sister as the officials entered the cabin. The scene inside the main room was disturbing enough on its own. Chemical bottles covered every surface, some empty, some still half full of amber liquid. The furniture was coated in white lime powder. The walls showed water damage and mold. Papers were scattered everywhere, journals and letters and photographs that told the story of 7 years of delusion. Margaret Whitfield began documenting immediately, her pen moving quickly across the page, despite her trembling hands. The bedroom door was closed, but not locked. Sheriff Talbert paused before opening it, his hand on the knob, aware that what came next would likely define the rest of his career in law enforcement. He opened the door slowly, and the smell that emerged made four officials step back, gasping for air. Even Dr. Finch, who had performed autopsies and examined bodies in various states of decay, had to steady himself against the doorframe. The bedroom was arranged like a shrine. Candles, long since burned down to nubs, ringed the bed in a circle. Bottles and jars lined the dresser in ordered rows, each labeled in Vera's handwriting with dates and chemical compositions. Photographs were propped against the mirror, showing Vera in her white dress beside a wrapped figure. But it was the bed itself that drew every eye and would haunt every person present for the rest of their lives. Owen Hutchins, or what remained of him, occupied the center of the mattress. He was wrapped from head to toe in layers of stained linen, the fabric discolored brown and yellow from years of chemical treatments and bodily fluids. The wrappings had been arranged carefully, maintaining a human shape, with the suggestion of arms crossed over the chest and legs extended straight. A fabric flower was pinned to what would have been his chest. Fresh clothing was folded neatly beside the bed, waiting for the next change that would never come. Dr. Finch approached first, his medical training overriding his revulsion. He touched the wrappings gently, noting their texture and the unmistakable rigidity beneath. Sheriff Talbert asked the question they all already knew the answer to. "Is he alive, doctor?" "No. He's been deceased for years. The body is mummified, preserved through chemical treatment and environmental conditions. I'll need to unwrap him for a proper examination. But there's no question this man has been dead for a very long time." Margaret Whitfield photographed everything with a camera the sheriff had brought. The images she captured would become evidence in the subsequent investigation, documenting not just the body, but the elaborate care Vera had taken to maintain the illusion of life. The makeup supplies on the dresser, the comb with strands of desiccated hair still caught in its teeth, the indentation in the pillow next to Owen's wrapped form, showing where Vera had slept night after night for 7 years. Deputy Vickers discovered the letters, boxes of them stacked in the corner, letters to Owen's dead mother describing their happy life. Love letters to Owen himself, tucked under his pillow. Journal entries describing conversations and physical intimacy with a corpse. The written record of Vera's complete psychological collapse, preserved in her own handwriting. Outside, Vera's screams intensified as she realized what was happening. "Don't take him from me. Please, he needs me. Owen, I'm here. I won't leave you." Loretta struggled to hold her sister, both women, collapsing to the ground in a tangle of grief and horror. Dr. Finch began the careful process of unwrapping the body for official examination. As each layer of cloth came away, The extent of Vera's preservation efforts became clear. She had essentially mummified her husband through repeated chemical treatments and controlled environment. The body was largely intact, though reduced to a leathered husk. Features were still recognizable. The hands, crossed over the chest, showed signs of careful positioning. This was not a body that had simply been left to decay. This was a body that had been tended to with obsessive care for over 7 years. The coroner's official examination would take hours, but his preliminary findings were clear. Owen Hutchins had died of pneumonia in October of 1928. The preservation techniques applied post-mortem had been remarkably effective, preventing the complete decomposition that would normally have occurred. There were no signs of foul play in the death itself, no indication that Vera had caused or hastened his demise. What had come after was something else entirely, a manifestation of grief so profound it had fractured reality itself. Sheriff Talbert made the decision not to arrest Vera on the spot. She was clearly not in her right mind, clearly unable to understand the nature of what she'd done. Instead, arrangements were made for her immediate transfer to Eastern Kentucky State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. The body would be removed for official examination and then, finally, properly buried. As they loaded Vera into the sheriff's automobile for transport, she fought against the deputies with surprising strength. Her eyes remained fixed on the cabin, on the bedroom window where Owen lay, and her voice carried across the hollow with terrible clarity. "I was a good wife. I never left him. He needed me and I stayed. Tell him I'll come back. Tell him I love him." The last thing the officials heard as they drove away was Vera's voice, still calling to her husband, still insisting on her devotion, still refusing to accept that the man she loved had been gone for 7 years and 8 months, and that all her care and chemicals and conviction had changed nothing except the shape of her own sanity. The psychiatric evaluation of Vera Hutchins began within hours of her arrival at Eastern Kentucky State Hospital for the Insane. Dr. Samuel Cordell, the chief psychiatrist, had reviewed the case file during the transport and understood he was dealing with something extraordinary. What he discovered during his initial examination would become the subject of medical papers and case studies for decades to come. Vera was calm during the first interview, almost serene. She sat in the evaluation room and explained with perfect clarity that a terrible mistake had been made. Owen was recovering from a long illness, and her nursing had been essential to his survival. The people who had taken her from the cabin didn't understand the medical complexities involved. She needed to return immediately before Owen's condition deteriorated without her care. Dr. Cordell noted that Vera showed no awareness that her husband was dead. When he gently presented this fact, using the coroner's report as evidence, Vera's response was immediate and forceful. The doctors were wrong. They had misinterpreted what they'd seen. Owen's condition made him appear deceased to those unfamiliar with his particular illness, but she knew the truth. She could feel his heartbeat when she lay beside him. She could sense his presence, his love, his need for her. The diagnosis took weeks to finalize, but the fundamental assessment was clear. Erotomania complicated by prolonged dissociative disorder with psychotic features. Vera had constructed an elaborate delusional system to avoid confronting her husband's death, and that system had become more real to her than reality itself. The isolation, the lack of intervention, and her own desperate need to maintain connection had created a feedback loop from which she could not escape. What disturbed Dr. Cordell most was Vera's sophistication in maintaining her delusion. She had learned preservation techniques, applied them with skill, kept detailed records that showed methodical thinking. This wasn't simple madness. This was intelligence bent entirely towards sustaining an impossible truth. Her journals demonstrated logical progression, problem-solving, adaptation when methods failed. She had been both completely insane and frighteningly competent. The hospital staff attempted various treatments over the following months. They tried rational conversation, showing Vera photographs of Owen's mummified remains, bringing Loretta to visit and reinforce reality. Nothing penetrated the delusion. Vera maintained that the hospital staff were mistaken, that Owen was waiting for her, that her absence was causing him suffering. She became agitated when prevented from discussing her return to the cabin, calm when allowed to talk about Owen as though he were alive. By 1937, the doctors accepted that Vera would likely never recover. Her grip on the delusion was too strong, too essential to her psychological survival. Accepting Owen's death would mean accepting that she had spent 7 years sleeping beside a corpse, maintaining an intimate relationship with decay itself. Her mind couldn't process that reality without complete collapse, so it simply refused to process it at all. Owen was buried in June of 1936 in the family cemetery on the hillside above the cabin. Vera was not permitted to attend. Sheriff Talbert and Dr. Finch were present, along with Loretta and a handful of community members who had known Owen before his death. The service was brief. Reverend Drummond spoke about the tragedy of death and the greater tragedy of being unable to accept it. The marker placed over Owen's grave listed only his name and dates, nothing about the 7 years his body had spent above ground in his widow's desperate embrace. The cabin was emptied and eventually torn down. No one wanted to live in a place where such horror had unfolded. The chemical bottles, the journals, the photographs, all became an evidence stored in the county courthouse basement. Loretta took a few personal items that predated the tragedy: photographs of Vera and Owen from their wedding, letters from happier times. Everything else was destroyed. Vera spent 16 more years in Eastern Kentucky State Hospital. She never wavered in her conviction. During monthly evaluations, she consistently described Owen as recovering, waiting for her, needing her care. She spoke of him in present tense until the day she died in 1952. Her last words reportedly asking a nurse to tell Owen she would be home soon, that she hadn't abandoned him, that their love was stronger than any obstacle the world could create. Dr. Cordell's final assessment, written shortly before his own retirement, concluded that Vera Hutchins represented an extreme case of grief-induced psychosis, complicated by isolation and enabling circumstances. Had there been earlier intervention, had the community not looked away for so long, had legal systems been equipped to handle psychological emergency rather than just physical crime, the outcome might have been different. But the combination of mountain isolation, Depression-era resource scarcity, and cultural reluctance to interfere had created perfect conditions for delusion to flourish unchecked. The case became a cautionary study in psychiatric literature, examining how love could twist into something unrecognizable, how devotion could become indistinguishable from madness, and how the human mind could construct elaborate fictions to avoid unbearable truth. Vera Hutchins had been a faithful wife in the most literal and terrible sense possible. She had stayed beside her husband through everything, refusing to acknowledge that death had parted them. Her devotion had been absolute, unwavering, and completely, horrifyingly wrong. The question that haunted investigators, doctors, and everyone who knew the story was simple but unanswerable. At what point had Vera's grief become madness? Had there been a single moment when reality cracked, or had it been a gradual descent so subtle that even she hadn't noticed the transition? And perhaps most disturbing, How many other isolated cabins, in how many other mountain hollows held similar secrets, hidden behind closed doors and fierce privacy, waiting to be discovered. If this story disturbed you, if it made you question the fine line between devotion and delusion, then you understand why these historical cases matter. We tell these stories not to sensationalize tragedy, but to understand the darkest capabilities of the human mind when grief and isolation combine. Hit that like button if you believe these forgotten cases deserve to be remembered. Subscribe, because there are dozens more stories like this one, hidden in courthouse basements and hospital archives, waiting to be brought to light. The past is full of horrors that nobody wanted to see, and somebody needs to make sure we finally look. That somebody is you. That somebody is us. Don't let these stories disappear back into the dark.